Thanks everyone for joining us, both in person and virtually for our PHIND seminar today. This is actually our first hybrid one, so we're starting to get a momentum going back in person. So glad to see some physical people as well. So just a couple of very brief announcements before we introduce our speakers. The two upcoming seminars we have Manoj, who's going to be presenting on July 19th, as well as Akshay, who will be presenting on August 16th. So looking forward to those talks coming up. But now I'll turn it over to Professor Gary Gold to introduce our speakers for today.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Well, I'm delighted to introduce for our June Precision Health and Integrated Diagnostics seminar, Dr. Allison Okamura and Dr. Kyle Yoshida. Allison received her bachelor's degree from the University of California in Berkeley and MS and PhD degrees from Stanford. She's a professor in the Mechanical Engineering Department at Stanford with a courtesy appointment in computer science and directs the CHARM lab, CHARM. She's an IEEE fellow and currently the co-general chair of the 2022 IEEE RSJ International Conference on Intelligent Robots and Systems, and is a deputy director of the Wuxi Neurosciences Institute. Her many awards include the IEEE Engineering in Medicine and Biology Society Technical Achievement Award, IEEE Robotics and Automation Society Distinguished Service Award, and Duca Family University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. Her academic interests include haptics, teleoperation, virtual reality, medical robotics, soft robotics, rehabilitation, and education. Outside of academia, Dr. Okamura enjoys spending time with her husband and two children, running and playing ice hockey. Dr. Yoshida is a mechanical engineering PhD candidate in the CHARM lab at Stanford. He majored in bioengineering and minored in African studies at Harvard University. He received the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, Stanford Graduate Research Fellowship, the Stanford Enhancing Diversity in Graduate Education Fellowship, American Indian Science and Engineering Society Lighting the Pathway Fellowship, and the Wuxi Mind Brain Computation and Technology Student Training Grant. His research spanning robotics and wearable mobile haptics has been recognized through the awards at the IEEE International Conference on Soft Robotics, the IEEE International Conference on Robotics and Automation, and the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology National Conference. In his free time, he manages Hanua Scholars, a STEM mentorship program recognized as one of the 2021 top 10 native STEM enterprises to watch by the American Indian Society and Science and Engineering Society. I'm delighted to introduce Allison and Kyle, who will speak today on a test in the palm of your hand investigating the use of smartphones for clinical testing of sensory function. Allison.
Great, thank you very much for the nice introduction, Gary, and thanks to the folks who are online, and especially appreciate those who came to join us in person. Let me see if I can get my slides shared. Thank you, Kara. So what we'll be talking about today, we being myself and Kyle, who's a PhD student in my lab, is about using smartphones to test touch sensory function. We're going to sort of divide this talk into two parts. I'm going to take the beginning where I'll give an introduction to the field of haptics, both in terms of human haptic perception and a little bit about haptic technology and how we define it, and even what the word haptic means for those who may not be familiar. And then I'll hand it over to Kyle. The project that we have, which is actually sponsored by PHIND, was really Kyle's brainchild during the pandemic about how we could do sensory function tests remotely. And so it's great that Kyle present that portion of the talk. So let me begin by comparing some senses. So when we think about what senses are valuable to us in our daily lives, there's vision, touch, taste, smell, etc. And it's useful to think about what is the most valuable sense, what's most important for the body to receive, or for us to maybe artificially feedback through technology. And because most people, if I ask them the question, what do you think is the most important sense to you? Most people answer to me vision. And there's no wrong or right answer here, but it's useful to have a comparison to understand what vision is good for, what touch is good for, and in particular, when we do work in the field of haptics or touch-based displays, what makes it so challenging? So I have this comparison in the slide where we're thinking about the role of sight and what it means compared to that of touch. So sight is centralized, right? You have eyes in nearly one location on your body, whereas touch is very distributed, right? All over our skin, throughout our whole body, we have touch sensors. Sight is very broad. I can stand at the front of this room and see all of you, whereas touch is narrow. If I wanted to go and have a touch interaction with Ryan, I might poke him in a very narrow, specific location, and we would only feel that in this very, very specific location. And that also highlights the next sort of duality, which is senses being more active versus passive. Now, anyone who does vision research knows that sight is not really passive, but I would say comparatively, from kind of an engineering point of view about how much energy needs to be input to have visual interactions versus touch interactions, like I said, for touch, I would have to walk over, I would have to move my body. That involves a lot of power, whether you think about making a robot with artificial touch or a haptic device that gives someone touch feedback. There's a lot of physical behaviors that are involved in that, which are very active and require power, whereas a sight can be a little more passive and less power hungry. Sight, this last point could definitely be argued, but sight is quite cognitive in terms of its processing. And that can be true for touch as well. However, there are a lot of aspects of touch, in particular reflexes, very fast reaction times that you can get based on touch stimuli, which can be more physical in nature and don't require cognitive processing. So both of these sensors are valuable. I sort of see them as dual in nature. And if we want to have people be able to interact with the world and using the other senses as well, you need to consider what are all the different roles of these sensory aspects. So digging into touch a little bit more, I'm going to give my definition of the word haptics. Haptics meaning anything really having to do with the sense of touch. And so that covers both things that are related to the skin or cutaneous feedback, as well as things that are more related to the muscles and joints and large scale motions of the body, which is kinesthesia. And both are very important for us to both be able to have a sense of ourself, of our own body, as well as interact with things in the environment. And while we're mostly talking about sensing, of course, sensing is integral to the motor control system, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later. In order to coordinate movement and in order to perceive, you also have to be able to move. So this gives a kind of high-level view of the different aspects of the sense of touch or haptics that we would need to consider if we want to both evaluate patient sensory ability or do what we often do in my lab, which is try to create haptic technologies that let people feel virtual or remote environments through the sense of touch. So much of science, and likewise in haptics, we learn about from special populations or scenarios where you lose some aspect of ability. So the same is true for touch. So on the cutaneous side or skin side, we can basically knock out the tactile sensors embedded in the skin through cold, for example. So if it's not too cold, it'll just be temporary. And you've probably had a situation where you've been in a cold environment, definitely not like today's hot first day of summer day here in California. But if you are in a cold environment and your tactile sensors in your skin are deadened, it becomes very difficult to do simple tasks like zipping up your jacket or buttoning a coat. And people often think, oh, my muscles are cold and that's why I can't do this task. But usually the muscles are actually pretty warm. They're, safe in a jacket and under layers of other tissue, whereas the tactile sensors embedded in the skin are more exposed to the cold. And what actually makes it most difficult to do these tasks is not your inability to move, but rather your inability to sense. When these tactile sensors in the skin get knocked out, you have very little understanding of what are the contact conditions of how you're interacting with your environment. You don't know if something has slipped from your grasp or if you have a firm hold on it. And that makes it very difficult to do simple tasks. And I will show an example a little bit to explain why this lighting a match example is relevant. On the other side here, kinesthesia and cutaneous sensing all get integrated for haptics, but it's kind of nice to separate them as illustrative examples. So kinesthesia, I think of as knowing how your body moves in space, as well as large-scale forces of interacting with the environment. And the best illustration of this is a patient who has lost kinesthesia or proprioception, in this case, over most of his body from the neck down. And there's a great BBC documentary about him called The Man Who Lost His Body. And it explains how even to do a simple task like walking, he needs to use his vision instead of his knowledge of his body's position in space in order to do simple tasks. And he would say, oh, if the lights turn out or if I get distracted by a pretty girl, he will crumple to the floor because he no longer has an idea of his body's configuration in space. So you losing either cutaneous or kinesthetic sensing can be extremely detrimental. And as we'll describe later, there are a number of diseases where this takes place, but it's not just diseases that causes this. Probably the most literal form of the loss of sense of touch is the loss of part of the body or a limb, in which you lose both motor control and sensory ability. And a lot of effort has gone into developing prostheses that can replace the motor ability, but our creation of artificial sensors and feedback of that sensory information to the human brain is still very nascent. So a lot of effort in prosthetics, but the focus has mainly previously been on motor and not sensory. And then other than this particular population, there are a bunch of specialized and not so specialized scenarios where people who have fully intact bodies lose perception without the implications of disease. So for example, if you are teleoperating a robot to find mines, which are buried in the dirt, if you are teleoperating a robot in space so that you can stay safely inside the International Space Station and not have to do a spacewalk, or something I've worked on for much of my career, teleoperated robot-assisted surgery, your actions in the world are being mediated by a robot. And while you might be able to use vision to accomplish some of these tasks without the sense of touch for feedback, regular everyday people, maybe not everyday people like an astronaut, not exactly an everyday person, but these folks cannot really do their jobs to their fullest without having this sense of touch. Then going back to more everyday people, whether it's virtual reality, like is shown here, or this next slide, which is a great illustration from a human-computer interaction designer about how does your technology see you, your smartphone or your iPad, what are the ways in which it interacts with you. This is very limited. And so our own interactions with computer systems and soon to be virtual and augmented reality, if they don't have haptic feedback, you are reduced to a pretty simple being. You have usually not stereo vision, although with more VR goggles, we're getting towards that. It's usually stereo audio. And usually have a finger, but usually it's one finger and it's an input, not a feedback mechanism. And so the more that we use these technologies and we want to use them in a seamless way, we need to be able to incorporate this haptic or touch feedback so that these interactions can be natural and efficient and useful. So long term, some of the goals of my research lab are to enable these kinds of physical connections through haptic feedback with these sort of aspirational wearable haptic devices that would be on different parts of the body that can let people give each other virtual hugs during Zoom calls, allow you to not look at screens while you're driving, but rather get directions that you can feel so that you're not using the already overloaded visual channel. And as other types of technology are around us, being able to communicate with them in more intuitive ways. So this is where we want to go in my lab. And the types of devices that exist, I'd like to start by giving you a few examples. So traditional as in like for the last 30 years or so, haptic devices have been what I think of as kinesthetic in nature. They apply large scale forces to the user and they're extremely compelling, but they're heavy desktop robots essentially that let you grasp onto the tip, move them around, and it will apply forces to you so that you can feel virtual objects or get signals. And the device shown here is about $25,000, extremely heavy, and it's not meant to be mobile. Now, of course, as we'll be getting to later in this talk, we do have simple vibrations as a great way to make haptic feedback more mobile, but that's going to be more of a cutaneous sense than a kinesthetic sense. And to illustrate the importance of this cutaneous sense, I've got this video shown here. What was shown on the left, sorry it's not looping, but it was just a very simple task of a woman lighting a match. This is, as you can tell from the clothes and the hair, is like from the early 80s, late 70s maybe. But it's a classic video from the field of haptics showing, you know, how easily someone can do a kind of complex task like picking up a match and lighting it. And to illustrate the importance of cutaneous and not just kinesthetic feedback, in this video, which I'll start in a minute, shows after the skin has been locally anesthetized on this person, she's trying to do this same task of striking a match. And she has all of her visual facilities. There's nothing wrong with her movement ability. That hasn't been compromised at all. She's simply lacking this tactile or cutaneous feedback. And now you'll see how difficult it is for her to do this task. So she doesn't know about the contact conditions between her skin and the small objects that she's trying to pick up. And despite vision and all the motor capability that she has, it takes her a long time to get a good grasp on the match and then eventually light it. Okay, so it's a good illustration of how difficult it would be to perform activities of daily living without the sense of touch. And these tactile sensors, or mechanoreceptors as they're called, embedded in the skin, is important to know, although I'm not trying to answer any questions about this in this talk, but it's important to know that there are many different types. And it depends whether you're talking about the hairy skin, which is on most of our bodies, versus the glabrous or non-hairy skin on the palms and other parts. There's different densities and spatial distributions depending on the type of skin. Different mechanoreceptors have different responses to frequency. And later, Kyle will be highlighting the importance of the Pacinian corpuscles as a mechanoreceptor, which is used for sensing relatively high frequency vibrations, which might seem somewhat artificial, but many of the tasks that we do in our daily lives, whether it's just running our fingers over a surface to get an idea of the texture, figuring out how hard to grasp it based on that, those high frequency vibrations play an important role in doing those tasks. So many different sensors, they respond to different frequencies, they have different densities in different locations on the body. All right, I think I'm gonna skip over this slide and just give a couple examples of what haptic technology in my lab looks like. So one example would be the haptic technology in particular that uses vibrations. So one example would be these armbands, which include multiple vibrating actuators, very similar to the kind that you find in cell phones. And we can vibrate them in different patterns in order to provide motion guidance. And this has also been used to guide people in making movements for stroke rehab. I'm going to kind of go through these quickly since they're just examples. Another interesting example for vibration feedback is using vibrations that are asymmetric. Rather than simply displaying a sinusoid, rather we display a signal which kind of hits hard in one direction and then recovers more slowly. And it turns out that these asymmetric vibrations, differently from the kind that you get from your cell phone, actually give a kind of tugging sensation, which means actually that the vibration feedback can directly convey directional information. We've also found that when people get this kind of vibration feedback, not only do they feel the tugging, they actually feel compelled to move in the direction of the tug, which is really interesting and actually not something we fully understand. So there's more studies to be done there. And then the last example I'll give, which is actually a stroke rehab application, is we've been applying passive tactile stimulation to participants who are wearing mobile gloves and showing that these passive vibration stimulations can actually reduce spasticity compared to a control group. So this is an early pilot with people getting passive tactile stimulation, having a higher modified Ashworth scale, a higher modified Ashworth scale, which is a good thing when you have after 8 weeks of the tactile stimulation compared to a control group that didn't have it. And we actually just finished a much larger clinical trial of this to understand better the mechanisms and test some of these hypotheses. And that's a result we actually hope to have published in the next month or two. So this is another form of vibration feedback. Here, it's not haptics where we're trying to display information, but rather we're trying to kind of retrain the neural circuits in the brain to understand and use tactile information and also see how that affects movement ability. So that was kind of my introduction to haptics in terms of giving you an idea of the background of the field and what we try to do with this technology. Now we're going to shift, and in just a couple slides, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to talk about our project, which has been supported by PHIND, which we affectionately term MOOPDICS. So this is kind of an inside joke at maybe 5 years ago or so. MOOCs, massively open online courses, were very popular. And what we wanted to do is create massively open online haptics, haptics that would be accessible to lots of people for use and training. So MOOPDICS stands for Massive Open Online Platform for Haptics. And our goal with MOOPDICS is to do both clinical studies as well as have a larger understanding of human perception than could be gathered through traditional laboratory experiments that are done to test haptic perception. So Kyle will be highlighting two different sort of sub-projects of this. One is specifically developing methods in order to do patient sensory testing. But then in a larger scale, we're interested in doing general human perception studies in a way that's really accessible and deployable to the millions and millions of smartphones that people have worldwide. And I'm going to send a couple slides motivating why we want to do this patient sensory testing and the role of vibrations in that. So I'm going to highlight two different scenarios that are both of interest to us, where people have diminished sensory perception, and we would like to be able to test these patient populations. The first is in stroke. So my lab has looked for a while at various aspects of stroke rehabilitation using robotic technology and engineering devices. And one of the things that we became really interested in is, although we did a lot of studies related to motor control, we were also interested in what is the role of sensation in enabling good motor control. So it's a sensory motor system where even if you have a perfectly good capability to move, if you can't perceive, like you lack proprioception or you lack contact information, you're not going to move well. And this slide is really not meant for you to understand every detail here, but just to note, we have a computational model where what we can do is we can plug in different sensory deficits. We could say, well, let's turn down the person's ability to accurately know where their arm is in space, or let's increase the noise that would be injected into the human sensory system. And then we could simulate what would happen if someone tried to do a simple point-to-point reaching movement, like these center-out tasks, in order to, under this condition where they have deficient sensory or motor ability. And here's an example just showing if you have some diminished sensory ability for proprioception, so knowing where your arm is in space, instead of being able to make these direct movements to targets, which would be the sort of control case with no extra noise added, this extra noise causes great deviations when you're trying to do this simple center out pointing task. So in stroke, we have found diminished sensory perception, both through experiments as well as through these models. And that's something that we would like to be able to track much better in this population. The other population I'll mention is people with peripheral neuropathy, which is extremely common. So this is any damage to the peripheral nerves themselves and that results in numbness, tingling, and pain, and generally reduced tactile perception. And the numbers here are extremely large over a lifetime. A huge percentage of the population will get it. And then as more and more folks wind up with diabetes, this also is a greater problem, this peripheral neuropathy. So there's many different backgrounds or reasons why people can develop this. And this is another area, another reason why we would like to be able to understand and track the progression of loss of sensory information in this disease. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle, who will talk about how we are doing this. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Allison. So currently the kind of gold standard for evaluating vibration perception is using the tuning fork test. And we have our tuning fork here, and this kind of just works by striking the tuning fork, and then it's placed on either the palm and other parts of the body. And this is used as kind of this binary measure to detect if the patient can have sensation. So one of the things that we saw is that this test is like a binary output. So it's just a yes or no, and it also requires a clinician. And there can also be quite inconsistent delivery of the exam based on how hard the tuning fork is struck and like how it's placed onto the skin. So our goal, we noticed that smartphones already have these actuators built in within them that we all have. So we wanted to use smartphones to identify and monitor sensory impairment. And one of the motivating factors is that a lot of times people with stroke or a lot of these conditions, it causes some economic hardship. And we want to be able to get different tools for these diagnostics and monitoring out to the population. And a lot of people already have smartphones, so what a great way. So there are 4 kind of steps to this. We wanted to characterize the tuning fork and smartphone vibrations, develop an app to monitor and test for sensory impairment, then conduct user studies using that app to verify that it works, and then deploy this app as a highly accessible tool for diagnosis and monitoring. So first we'll talk about this vibration characterization. So this was a very important part of the project. When we were digging around in the Apple Core haptics library, we found that there's 2 parameters, haptic intensity and haptic sharpness. And it was unclear as to what these 2 parameters directly controlled. So we wanted to see how the vibrations from the phone compare to the tuning fork. We wanted to see what variables we can modify, and then we wanted to confirm that the phone could be used as a platform feasible for these sensory tests. So to do this, we attached an accelerometer to the base of the tuning fork and also to the center of the phone. And in doing this, we were able to measure the accelerations created by each device and then better understand what outputs the phone can produce. The middle set of graphs show the time domain accelerations, where we can see that with the tuning fork, between the different trials, we actually get a lot of variability in terms of the amplitude of the accelerations produced. However, in the phone, we find that we can produce more consistent signals. Additionally, based on the FFTs, we're actually using a 128 hertz tuning fork, but its resonant frequency is almost at 180 hertz. So this shows that even like these kind of core measures and core hardware that's used isn't always consistent. But we were able to find that the iPhone is consistently outputting a frequency around 240-ish hertz. And that this frequency actually is in the range of the Pacinian corpuscles, which Allison mentioned earlier. And that's also a good signal because it means that it kind of directly links into that vibration sensory pathway. Additionally, we found that the haptic intensity variable modifies amplitude on the smartphone. So we found that by increasing that haptic intensity, we're able to get larger amplitudes. The haptic sharpness variable was a little more muddied, where it was able to modify both the amplitude and the frequency. So because of this, we decided to move forward with modifying intensity for our app. So we created this mobile app, and we have it loaded here on our iPhone 12, which you guys can test after the talk. But essentially, it's developed in Xcode using the Apple Core Haptics framework, and we also have it integrated with Firebase. And essentially, the app is a button, and you can't really hear it or feel it, but I can feel it. But essentially, it's creating vibrations, and after I feel a vibration, I would just press the button and say, yay, I felt it. And the way that we test this is using the staircase method. And the staircase method works by having an increasing intensity of the stimulus when you don't feel it. And when you finally feel the stimulus, then we decrease that intensity. And after you have all of these reversals where like, oh, I feel the stimulus, then I give you a smaller stimulus, and then you don't feel it. So then it has these reversals, and we can use those reversals to then calculate the absolute intensity threshold. We provide the vibrations at pseudo-random intervals. So in this case, like we don't want someone to be able to just say, oh, I feel something every 2 seconds and have kind of these false positives. So we give this random interval, and we have a timer to check for these false positives. And then we have, button for user response. So we conducted 2 small pilot studies to determine if this app was feasible. The first tested consistency. So shown in this graph, we have where the dark squares are where the stimulus is detected, and the white blank squares are where it's undetected. So our intensity starts low, it starts to increase, and then finally when someone starts to feel it, then are these reversals. So our first pilot study consisted of 1 participant for 10 trials, and we just wanted to make sure that the app was able to consistently measure the threshold from a single user. And we were able to confirm this. So we got a threshold with a pretty small standard deviation of 0.04. And what this shows is that the app, when it's delivered, it has this consistency. The second study that we did was on generalizability. So we got 3 healthy participants and did 1 trial each, just to make sure that the app worked in the various ranges that their perception threshold would be in. So we have another set of values from the intensities that they perceive. Another thing to note is that the intensities shown in these numbers are actually scaled off of Apple's core haptics library. So we can go back and also match it back to the actual accelerations to understand more of like the actual G's that the person feels. So from this sensory testing app, we have a conclusion that smartphones can produce consistent and controlled vibrations for the exam. And this is based on our 2 mini tests. And to further go into that, we want to develop the app and deploy it to stroke patients and other healthy users. we also want to test it at different body locations. So we actually have one of the students working on a voice command input so that when the phone isn't held in the hand, people can give a voice response. We're also integrating it with Firebase so that it can be downloaded on the App Store and that data can be processed back to our lab. And we just got IRB approval for all of this. And then also testing and characterizing other phones. So because each phone is unique and has different sort of placements of the Taptic engine for iPhones or different actuators, a lot of these phones actually have to be manually characterized to ensure that this scale is consistent across the devices. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was how we can use smartphones in general human perception studies. So a lot of the things that we found from this sensory testing is that these phones can be used as a really good tool to get people involved in our studies so that we're not just handpicking 20 to 24-year-old engineering students for our haptics user studies, but we can actually broadly incorporate the larger population who will all use this type of technology. So we had the idea for a distraction study, and our motivating question was, how do cognitive loads and physical movement change our perception to vibrations created by smartphones? So as Allison mentioned earlier, as we have more haptic devices used in the real world with interacting with robots, virtual agents, and other humans, or our video game controllers or phones, how do we have to modify the vibrations when we get these distractions? So we can think of an example where someone is using their Apple Maps and they're walking around, but when they're walking around and having focus on all the different buildings, how do we have to change the vibration stimuli presented for the user? So we developed another iPhone app that implements a vibration response task and an end-back task. So first I'll go over the vibration response task. This task consists of giving the user a bunch of vibrations. We took 9 vibration intensities, again delivered at random intervals to prevent for false positives. And it's just repeated 10 times each. And it's simply a button, and they just press the button when they feel a vibration. And another task that we built into the phone is the end-back task. And what this does is it creates a cognitive distraction for the user. So every 3 seconds, a shape is shown, whether it be a square, triangle, circle, or a hexagon. And the user responds when the same shape is shown consecutively. So an example of this for this shape sequence, where we give the user square, circle, triangle, triangle, square, the user would press a button when they see that second triangle because they see it happen twice in a row. There are other ways to make this more difficult by doing like a 2-back, where it's like you see the same shape 2 steps before. But essentially, this was just created to give the user a cognitive distraction. In addition to this, we developed a special phone case so that when the user holds the phone, they distribute the forces the same between participants. So we can see this after too. And what this does is it prevents people from overly squeezing the phone, because if people are like really squeezing the phone, then they would be able to better sense the vibrations. So this kind of helps normalize that. And then this last picture is just a screenshot of the experiment where we have these shapes shown on the screen, a red button to input if you feel a vibration, and a blue button if you see that shape consecutively. In addition to this, we tested different experimental conditions where we give them either a single task or dual task. So the single task is just doing the vibrations, and a dual task is when you have the end-back task while you're responding to the vibrations. We also test this in physical conditions where we have participants sitting and walking. So in total, there's kind of these 4 conditions, and we would kind of think that when you have this dual task with this cognitive load, but also this physical distraction from walking, that they would kind of perform the worst. And have a more difficult time sensing vibrations. And then intuitively, when you're just sitting and focusing on the phone with no cognitive or physical distractions, we would expect to kind of perform the best at detecting those vibrations. We're able to, so these are, so these are psychometric curves. The circles are kind of indicative of the number of responses that the participant gives for an intensity. So the x-axis is intensity, and we can see in the top right corner, as the intensity increases, the response probability asymptotes out at 1. And this means that when you have a lot of these large vibrations, the participant can always feel them. And then in the bottom left, it asymptotes down to 0. And it means that when your vibrations get really small, the participants can no longer sense them. And we're able to use this curve to create a psychometric function that we can then use to compare between participants. But before going into that, one of the first things we noticed when plotting this is that for participants, we found that between the conditions, we see this right shift in the curve. And what this right shift indicates is that there is an increased perception threshold to feel the vibration. So as we go to between sitting and walking, or sitting with and back compared to walking with and back, we actually need a larger vibration stimulus in order to respond to it. Now we can pull out the points where it crosses the 50% line for response probability, and those are called the 50% thresholds. And we can then average that over across the subjects. So we have 3 subjects and the 4 conditions, and we see again that the lowest bar shows that when a participant is sitting and just doing the vibration task, their 50% threshold is the smallest. When we add a cognitive load, which is the end-back task, then their threshold begins to increase. And then when we add this physical distraction, it increases even more. And then when we have both the cognitive and physical distraction, they require the highest threshold. In addition to this, we also looked at the response times from the experiment. So we found that when participants are sitting or walking, they actually respond with the same speed to the vibrations. However, when they're doing a cognitive task, they actually have a higher response time. So this is kind of showing that it's not so much the physical distraction that impacts how fast we respond to a vibration, but rather it's the cognitive distraction that affects our response time. And to conclude this portion, we found that vibrations are more difficult to detect in the presence of cognitive and physical distractions. And going on to this, we want to conduct the study on more participants. And we also want to be able to deploy this app using Firebase and record data from people at home all over the world so that people can just freely download this app, contribute to our body of knowledge, and help us not only to further knowledge and kind of general human perception, but a lot of this data can also be used to also understand more about the baseline sensory characteristics from large populations, which can also be used as kind of baselines for our clinical study app. And to conclude wrap up the whole thing, we essentially show different ways that we can use smartphones to study perception in broad populations. We talked about how we can use the smartphone as an app for a clinical sensory test that can be widely distributed. And we also showed that we can use it for general human perception studies, specifically on this experiment on distractions that we might encounter in daily life. And we'd like to thank a few of the students who worked on it. A special shout out to Rachel, who's the leading PhD student on the sensory test, the clinical sensory test. Kara, who helped a lot with the idea generation and creating the ideas backing this. A lot of the undergrads, Joel, Stephen, Bryce, Destiny, who helped with vibration characterization, developing the different apps and figuring out how all of the Apple Core haptics framework works. And then Alexis and Sean, who are really awesome programmers who helped us develop the apps, create this whole Firebase integration, and help us understand the data transfer processes for IRB. And we'd also like to thank NSF, who supported some of our fellowships, and definitely PHIND, who believed in us to do this project. And thank you.
So we can, if you have any questions, I'll bring the mic to you. And then maybe.
Hi, do the different kind of corpuscles detect different frequencies of vibrations? And then could you use that to design more sort of multi-dimensional haptic systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, indeed, they have different frequency ranges. So the tuning corpuscles, which we mentioned a couple times, are really the highest frequency sensors. They can, yeah, typically activate from about 50 hertz up to 1,000 hertz. And then you have a number of others which operate at lower frequencies. They do all have some overlaps. You know, there's not sharp barriers between the different frequency ranges, but we could stimulate at those different frequency ranges. For example, in the clinical studies, to maybe in particular peripheral neuropathy, to understand, yeah, which types of nerves are being damaged. Yeah, that is not something that we've tried yet, but it would be a great idea. Thanks.
Is there any baseline study for any patient group or healthy subjects? They have any baseline study for such movements? Any patterns in there they have shown, or you're the first one may show that?
You mean baseline studies on vibration perception? Yeah, so there are, well, so first of all, there have been a lot of, or a few at least, studies related to age, and I didn't show any of those results, but people have showed the degradation in vibration perception with age. So that is also a potential confounding factor with the disease states that we want to study. I guess in terms of other sensory tests, there's been some performed, but I feel like Kyle, you may be able to back me up here, but I feel like the data has been very preliminary and there isn't a kind of like baseline or data set for stroke or sensory neuropathy. It's a clinical test that's done with the tuning forks, but that data isn't really sort of collated because I think it's typically used just to track an individual patient, because as we saw, each tuning fork is different and it depends on how it's used. So it probably doesn't make sense to use that clinically collected data because it's sort of acquired in such an inconsistent way across the clinician and across the patients. So I think that's probably why we don't see much data there. But Kyle, you have anything else you want to say about that?
I think, yeah, there's not much, but one of the motivating factors kind of studying general human perception is that we can kind of create that database across all of those demographics, age, across ages, like technological background, like experience using haptics. And I think that could also be a core base in understanding these baselines.
I'll just make one other comment related to this, which is we are wondering if we, put the cell phone out there and app out there and people record data and we want folks from all walks of life, like socioeconomic status, history of manual labor, all these sorts of things are going to affect tactile perception. And however, when we don't do these tests in the lab, the likelihood that things are not really, data is not collected in an ideal manner goes high. And so one of the things we're wondering is getting lots and lots of kind of unsupervised, maybe iffier data from large population. How does that compare to testing a much smaller population in the lab, and how reliable and how comparative can we be between these different types of data sets? I think there's a lot of promise in showing that we can collect very large data sets from smartphones and wearables as more and more groups are starting to do this. But understanding the reliability of that data is, I think, going to be a challenge.
Building on that, you mentioned your specialized phone case. So I can see if you're trying to get a large population, you can't obviously hand out those phone cases. So are you trying to eventually design around that and not have to have that as one of the elements?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we think we might be able to do is actually use the pressure measurement on the screen of the phones. So if you're using a smartphone where you actually interact by pressing on the screen, you can actually get a measurement of how much force is being applied. And so we could either have people regulate their applied force by giving them some kind of biofeedback signal, oh, you're pressing too hard, or we could have an understanding about how that force relates to vibration perception and kind of account for that or calibrate for that. So I think that's one of our next goals in terms of improving the app, in addition to the voice control that Kyle mentioned, is could we actually use effectively the force sensing in the phone itself to ensure that people are either ensure they're applying a particular force or understand what force they're applying. Great point, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, Ashley, go ahead if you can read the Zoom question for us.
Yes, very, very exciting work. When you consider field testing, I'm concerned about testing for other distractions, for example, auditory background for people in the real world or visual distractions. Have you thought about testing the effect on these distractions as well on your sensing?
Yeah, so about other distractions in the world, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, so there's a lot of different types of distractions. We are choosing these distractions because we can deliver it through the phone consistently. What's also different is that a lot of human perception studies that are created are done in the lab without any of these distractions at all. So oftentimes we measure devices with kind of the best case scenario on what people will perform with. But I think that allowing for this and also other distractions that you mentioned would be able to kind of better understand the perception side. I also feel like I didn't answer your question.
You can test the distractions, at least theoretically, in the lab under controlled conditions. Play music in the background, does that make a difference? Or show visual images in the background in the lab, does that make a difference? So I know you can't predict what's going to happen in the real world completely, but you may find these distractions have very little effect, then you don't have to worry about them as much.
Right, yeah, exactly. That's a great point. And I think, well, there's what Kyle said, but in addition, are there calibrations, right? Can we understand what the calibration factor should be on interpreting someone's perception data based on what these distractions are. But just like with force, we could probably use the cell phone to measure ambient sound. We could probably measure through accelerometers and inertial measurement units within phones how they're being moved around in the environment, right? So the walking tests that Kyle described they were done in a lab on a treadmill. So we could specify a specific walking speed, but we can probably get a decent measurement of walking speed if people give us access to get that kind of data off their cell phones.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. I think towards the beginning, you talked about stimulation and it looked like there's some boost in performance and sensory performance from that. I was just wondering if you did that, when you do the stimulation, if you were to remove that, do they still maintain some of the benefit, or does it need to be done kind of a recurring basis? Or, what kind of patterns have you observed in that area?
Thanks. So you're asking about our stroke rehab glove, if that's right. Yeah, so this passive tactile stimulation, it is a long-term benefit and not an acute benefit. We've actually been trying to understand if we can do something different or change the vibration sequence or the amplitude or something to get more of have it as a kind of local treatment, like, oh, I want to go and do this task. Can I give myself some vibrations first? But the experiment that I showed was really about wearing the glove for several hours a day for 8 weeks and then testing on a weekly basis. I didn't show the week-to-week progression, and there are those progressions, but we don't really see acute effects. But we feel like if we can give long-term effects, we should also be able to generate acute effects, but we don't know how to do that ideally. I think most stroke patients who have these deficits, what they really want is rehabilitation and to see the long-term benefit. But the other thing we also don't know, because we haven't done this yet in our clinical studies, is how does it then go down over time? 8 weeks later, are you back to where you were before? We don't know that yet, but we feel like we have enough preliminary data now to write the NIH proposals to do those longer-term clinical studies and understand both acute and then very long-term effects. Like, does it actually go down once you stop using the device?
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks so much for a really exciting presentation from both of you, and really great potential for scalability as well. I really appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Thanks for having us.